and welcome to Daily Debrief from People's Dispatch. I'm Pragya. Brazil's historic election is set for Sunday, and the million-dollar question is who will emerge victorious? As right-wing President Jair Bolsonaro raises the election fraud alarm, challenger Luiz Inácio da Silva has promised a new chance to create a socially democratic left wing. Next, there's discontent in Europe. Why are people protesting in France, the UK, and other countries? And a historic milestone is crossed as Olympic commissions reflect gender parity off and on the field in Paris 2024. All this in today's episode. Polls show left-wing Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva leading before Brazilians vote for a new president. Lula promises prosperity with democracy and a new engagement with the region. Incumbent President Jair Bolsonaro, who is trailing as per polls, is in the center of attention for claims he has made in the past questioning the voting system. His support base is also mobilizing. To understand the situation, we have with us Zoe of People's Dispatch, who is reporting from Sao Paulo, Brazil. Hi Zoe. Zoe, a day before the elections, what are the polls saying?
It's quite interesting. There have been a series of polls that have been voter intention polls that have been released over this past week. These polls have different methodologies. Some of them have been direct phone calls, other are in person, some are meeting people in the street, but all have indicated an increase in the voter intention towards Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who's the party of the Progressive Workers' Party. This has shown that it's possible that he will win at least 47% in the first round. Other polls predict that of the total valid votes, which excludes the blank votes and the invalid votes, that he would be able to win in this first round. It's a tight race. It's looking like that's a possibility, but it's not a sure thing. But this is what the polls are showing. Jair Bolsonaro has mostly stayed still at around 33%, hasn't seen much increase on that front. And all of their candidates, Ciro Gomes is the candidate with the next largest amount of votes, which is only 7%. All of their candidates are polling at 1%. Luiz Inácio da Silva is leading, and he has more voting intention than all of their candidates combined.
Right, Zoe. Zoe, in the run-up to this election, which is tomorrow, what have been the assurances, promises, the campaign points of both Lula and Bolsonaro?
Well, I think it's important to remember, as we've covered on this show and as we've covered at People's Dispatch, is that, and so all candidates have really had to respond to the fact that there's over 33 million people who are hungry, over 125 million people who are food insecurity, that there's been a massive increase in homelessness, that hundreds and thousands of people who died during the pandemic is a tremendous loss. And so all candidates have actually had to respond to this, even Jair Bolsonaro himself, who for many, he is the person who is responsible for this. So it's interesting, he's saying that this is because of the legacy of the Workers' Party governments that were in power before him. Of course, we know there was a coup that took Dilma Rousseff out of office in 2016. And since then, it's really been this process of instability and devaluation of all the social rights, labor rights, etc. So Jair Bolsonaro has really focused on the fact that this isn't his fault, but also trying to counteract this rhetoric that there is a crisis. And then he's above all doubled down on the fact that he's going to crack down on corruption and that the Workers' Party is corrupt. He often brings up the fact that Lula da Silva was unfairly in prison for 580 days. And he says, look, he's a criminal. He was convicted. Of course, not mentioning the fact that the court actually exonerated him and admitted fault. So he's really focused on this, trying to mobilize people around the fact that it's all the Workers' Party fault. He's actually not bringing many concrete campaign promises. He's tried to highlight some of the very, very marginal social programs that he proposed, of course, dismantling prior programs. This is one thing. On the other hand, the Workers' Party candidate Lula has also been responding to the situation of crisis, but he's had more emphasis on reactivating a very strong government. He's emphasized the role that the government must play in rescuing Brazil from this crisis, from bringing people out of hunger, increasing the number of people who have access to education. He's really hammered down on these crucial issues of solving the crisis and addressing people's fundamental rights.
Zoe, in the end, what are people saying around the world about this election and the possible outcome?
Well, Brazil is one of the largest economies in the world. It's one in Latin America. It's the largest country here. So it has a lot of importance worldwide, not only within Latin America, but globally. It was part of the very important BRICS alliance, which its participation significantly declined during Jair Bolsonaro's presidency. And so this means that it is of global attention. People have watched with concern as Jair Bolsonaro has taken very extreme measures throughout his presidency. Even when he was elected, it was a cause for concern globally. But during his handling of the pandemic, he became famous for being one of the worst COVID deniers across the world, for calling it a small cold, for banning or trying to fight governors, for example, in the possibility of even carrying out isolation measures, blocking patents from being approved. Many people have taken a stand in saying that it is important that Jair Bolsonaro not be elected. They're saying that he's a threat to global democracy. And so many have taken a stance on this and recognize the importance of these elections. Of course, if Lula is elected, he is reactivating the BRICS alliance. He also wants to work towards regional integration. So you see with the rise of progressive leaders on Latin America, they're looking with a lot of hope and excitement that Latin America can once be a unified and strong bloc that can actually stand up to other global powers and have a say in the world economy. So many people are watching these elections. Global leaders are announcing their support for Lula da Silva, emphasizing the importance, for example, of the respective rule of law. There was for a while a serious concern that Jair Bolsonaro would attempt a military coup if he did not get elected. Those concerns are still on the table for many people. Senators and members of Congress in the United States even penned a letter warning that the US should cut military funding if Jair Bolsonaro attempted a military coup. So people are wary, and they're also hopeful that a stronger Brazil would also mean a stronger region and a stronger global South.
Right, Zoe, an election that's definitely going to be watched around the world. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Protests across the spectrum have broken out in Europe in recent days. Thousands took to the streets in Paris seeking higher wages to beat the soaring inflation. More protests are likely in the coming days from Paris to Prague to Berlin and elsewhere. As Europe reels under energy and cost of living crisis, thousands of UK citizens say they won't pay energy bills in protest. Demands to change government policies, especially on pensions and wages, are also rising fast. Some countries offer economic packages, but will they stop the anger? We speak to Prashant. Prashant, Europe seems to be set for a winter of discontent. Can you tell us what's going on?
Right, so it's a multifaceted problem. I mean, there's no real single way to summarize all of it. I mean, there are some entry points, so to speak. So if you look at, for instance, the numbers, there are various estimates which say that Europe is looking for a recession that's 2 quarters of negative GDP growth, probably the last quarter of 2022 and the first of 2023 definitely. The individual country estimates vary. A lot of analysts agree that Germany is probably one of the most vulnerable countries, which might definitely go into a recession. Now the question of whether France, Italy, Spain, etc. will go is a different question. But even if they do not go into recession, the growth is likely to be very, very minimal. So that's one way of looking at it. The second aspect is that there's definitely a huge energy crisis, and we have to be very clear about the fact that the Europeans are completely to blame. There's no other way of putting it, because there was no reason for Europe to sort of march in lockstep with the United States and impose these heavy sanctions on Russia when Europe actually depends on Russia for a lot of its energy needs. And they, of course, chose to ignore all that, pretended that they would somehow stigmatize Russia, and they would create this international coalition of people who would be supplying energy to each other. Or whatever the understanding was, it's still very unclear. But what is clear is the fact that there is definitely an energy crisis that Europe is staring at, and this has affected a vast spectrum of activities. There have been multiple reports coming in recent times of, for instance, industrial production itself slowing down, companies may be shutting down. There is, even in terms of gas prices, there is a considerable increase that has taken place. Equally important to note at this point that the gas price and energy prices, electricity prices increase all come from the fact that it's also about how the market is structured, as we have discussed on this show before. So it's not necessarily the only reason is not that the gas prices are high, but the nature of how the electricity market is structured means basically that these prices will continue to remain high. electricity prices across the board will remain high because the gas price is a bit high, even if other sources are not that expensive because of how the market is structured, and equally the fact that this basically means that private companies make a lot of profits at this point of time. And what we're basically also seeing is that workers taking to protesting in a number of countries across Europe, very angry at the fact that inflation is also rising at a considerable rate. Now, the solution that the European authorities are thinking of is basically to what is called raising the interest rates. Now, what that does basically is that it may help combat inflation, but basically by what one of our friends is called a sledgehammer blow to the economy. It basically reduces economic growth or risks reducing economic growth even further. So even the way of combating inflation is probably only going to worsen the situation as it exists right now. So we have clearly a multi-pronged crisis. There's a crisis of production. There is a social crisis. There are protests taking place across the board with a huge amount of public anger on these issues. It's called a cost of living crisis now. It should actually be called a cost of capitalism crisis, because this is not something new.
Right.
It's intensified, of course, because the Russia-Ukraine war, no doubts about that, and the very nonsensical sanctions policies that the Europeans imposed. They shot themselves in their own foot. There's no other way of looking at it. But the fact is that there are also structural issues of the economy, of the power sector, for instance, which have brought this about.
Prashant, what are the unions doing about this? What are the plans for mobilization that we know about so far?
So we have covered quite a bit of this. There's been this wide range of mobilizations across, all European countries. You can say almost all European countries at this point, because even this week we saw the French trade unions, of course, organizing a day of action. British mail workers are on strike, for instance. Some 8 to 10 days ago, we had the Dutch workers protesting. We had in Germany protests across the political spectrum taking place. In Belgium, huge protests took place. Very, very similar themes that are raised by many of these protesters. One of the main questions is, of course, an increase in the minimum wage, because as far as many of these workers see it, the biggest problem is not being able to afford the basic essentials of life, especially as the electricity prices are really going up. So one major demand is for actually an increase in wages. Another key, equally important demand is social security benefits, expanding the net, so to speak. The third very significant demand, I think, which has been almost made in common across countries, is the demand that the excess profits of power energy companies, for instance, which are actually making quite a bit of money at this point of time, actually be taxed. And even, or for that matter, all big corporates, but also energy firms, that their profits sort of be taxed, so that, and this money be used to provide social security and social benefits. There is a lot of focus, for instance, also on the environmental aspect of it, because natural gas was supposed to be the transition fuel as far as the European countries were concerned before they moved into renewable energy. But now England has recently removed a ban on fracking. We know that Germany is sort of thinking or going back to coal in various phases. So all this has also been a setback to the plans for moving into a more green energy production system, so to speak. So there's also strong demand that these profits be also used to invest in some other ways. A larger public services, for instance. There's a huge question of all kinds of, let's say, the labor market itself. The fact that jobs should be guaranteed, there should be more permanent jobs, less contractualization, because all this really helps workers and the mass of the population deal with some of the immediate impacts of this crisis, because it's not just a crisis of numbers, of percentages, of the policies of central banks. This is a crisis that is being felt on a day-to-day basis by people across the continent. So their demands are mainly for this. One of the aspects has been that because of the anger over some of these issues, and the anger is very palpable, many countries in Europe have been forced to consider putting caps on energy prices. So we do know that Holland is either considering it or has implemented it. We do know that the British are also in a similar situation. France is also has introduced proposals to actually sort of reduce the burden of energy prices. But this is just a first step, because this alone does not necessarily solve the problem. So it's really a difficult time for the people in Europe. Definitely a lot of anger that is kind of bubbling. Whether this will lead to even greater protests, which might threaten some of the governments, important question to see in the next few months.
Right, Prashant. Thanks a lot for joining us. The International Olympic Committee has appointed an equal number of women and men to the IOC commissions for 2022. It's a milestone for gender balance in sports at the level of governance, which edged closer to this target in 2020 in Tokyo. We'll talk to Siddhant Ani from NewsClick about the decisions taken and their impact. So, Siddhant, never an easy thing, gender parity, and easy to talk about, perhaps less easy to achieve. What do we have here? What are the decisions of the IOC you think are most important?
Yeah, thanks for the question. But yeah, I'll get into the aspects of the decision making, or rather the appointments that have happened at the International Olympic Committee in a second. Before that, like you rightly pointed out, it's an ongoing discussion and also a process of how to make sport overall not just gender parity, but more inclusive from various aspects. Right, gender parity. The discussion has been mostly centered on, from the athlete's perspective, one of how much they earn. Here, it's a slightly wider or a more bird's eye kind of situation, because we're talking about governance and how sort of policy and frameworks of international sport is shaped, right? And how important it is to have gender parity in that sense, so that you're not then trying to be inclusive at a later stage, whereas your entire processes are geared to only a particular section of society. So in governance, and this has always been the argument, that unless you have as many women or women represented at least proportionately in decision-making processes, there's no way that you can achieve it on the ground. And so today is, in that sense, a major milestone in, I suppose, global sports governance.
Siddhant, what kind of impact can we expect from this?
Yeah, Pragya, so like we were discussing before we started recording for this show, at the Tokyo Games in 2021, when they eventually happened because of the pandemic, it was almost equal in terms of the number of athletes participating, men and women. And we've seen like a massive increase also in terms of officials, right? So even when you have only men in a particular discipline, that doesn't exclude women officials from taking part, as whether it's as referees or television judges, or let's say anti-doping officers. So those restrictions don't anymore, or those distinctions don't anymore exist. At 2024 Paris, the next Olympic Games for senior athletes, the big Olympic Games, we will have 50-50%. So it's a good step forward by the Olympic movement. Because it means globally, if it's a shared platform, at least half that space is being given to women. But more than that, having as much or much greater representation in, like I said earlier, the decision-making process, it means that over a longer period, I think, when ground-up strategies are created, like for the participation of children in sport, they won't be targeted specifically to a particular gender, or even for that matter, the man-woman binary, right? So the Women in Sport Commission, for example, of course, these are only semantics at this point, but it's been renamed the Gender Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Commission. So presumably over the next few years, the conversation will expand and also include other sexual minorities and the transgender community, which is a very important part of, I suppose, the world, but the bird is almost completely excluded from all of this conversation. So hopefully going forward, all of these conversations will widen, and diversity and inclusion will actually become something that, because voting rights at the IOC level is now being more shared, like you mentioned about refugees as well being included in as IOC members, which means they have voting rights. So that's one part of it. And then next level is governance, who's executing some of those agenda points and putting policy in place. There as well, if you have a good and proportional representation, then you can hope that actually inclusion will become more than just a word.
Right, Siddhant. Thanks a lot for joining us. And that's all we have for today. Thank you for watching Daily Debrief. Do come back to us on Monday. You can find more such stories on our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and our regular updates on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.